Now let's go to the most recent recession, 2007, 2009, sometimes called the Great Recession. And again, what was it caused by? Fiscal, monetary, price, some other thing going on? Let's try to use the model to take a peek. Now this is a more complicated situation, and it's not going to give a straightforward answer. It's going to be more complicated. In fact, economists have not resolved this by any means yet. In fact, it's because it's not over. So when you review the facts, you see this. So here's the facts again. Same kind of picture we've used before. Real GDP is in blue, it's moving up, it's a recession, and it continues to move again. You see potential GDP here, a trend in the red. Again, the scale's over on the right in real 2009 dollars and billions of them. And then we're measuring these deviations of real GDP from potential through this gap, the percentage deviation. Scale over on the left. So that's the nature of the diagram. Drawn a dotted line to indicate 0, that's when real GDP is equal to potential. So you now can quite easily see the pattern. You go above and then you come down and you're below. But this is not complete in time yet, because as of 2013, well into 2013, you can see the economy has not gotten back to normal. That green line has not approached the dotted line. The blue line has not got back to the red line, as in the other two cases we've seen. So this story is not finished, and therefore the explanation of this story is not finished. Indeed, you're going to see there's a lot to be examined to figure out what's going on. So let's first look at inflation, and then look at our diagram with inflation and the gap on the same picture. There's inflation. Well, there's some stuff at the beginning that kind of looks similar to the other recessions and episodes. You can see there's a period where inflation's picking up, and then it's starting to come down. But in this case, it's quite a bit different than the others. It kind of overshoots quite a bit and then comes back. And in fact, the inflation rate now is not too much different from what it was at the beginning. So it's similar to those other cases, but indeed considerably more complicated, in particular that sharp decline of inflation, which occurs around the same time as a sharp decline in the economy. Now, you might guess when you put these observations on inflation and real GDP together in the diagram, it's going to look a little different. Indeed, it does. There it is. So on the horizontal axis again, we have this gap measure again. The vertical axis, we have inflation. And it's hard to see those counterclockwise loops. In fact, to the extent that they began to take place, they seem to be aborted in midstream. So again, you just look carefully at these points. We're starting the plots in 2003 first quarter, and then we're seeing how these move over time up towards 2006 at the top, and then it's coming down 2007, 2008 you can see, and then it's moving over to the left, all the way down to the bottom, 2009, and then back up to 2013. There are some of the patterns that we would see in just the regular movement of the economy according to the aggregate demand inflation adjustment model. One is shown at the top part of the diagram, where you see this positive movement between real GDP and the inflation rate. It's going up in that particular area. However, you don't see it looping back around again, as we saw in the other pictures. You don't see it moving over there. It goes right down again. It goes right down in that direction. So that's a difference than we've seen. So something different happened here. And then you can see there's also the movement we've seen before, the movement predicted by the model. As you're going over to the left below potential GDP, you see this decline in the inflation rate, and you see this sharp movement over to the right. And so that's much like what we've seen before, except in this case, you don't come zooming over here. You're not returning to the point you've seen. You're sort of stuck over in that direction. So there's some other things going on here, and the question is, what's going on in terms of the model? Obviously, there's some other things besides just the operation of monetary policy as we've described it before. So let's try to do that with the model and see what we get. There's the model. As usual, I want to sort of see what happens 2003, 2006, 2008 with the model. So in terms of the model, we likely have these shifts in aggregate demand, but this time the inflation adjustment curve's sort of going up at the same pace. And so now you do have this possibility of a movement directly towards the northwest. It's not as in the diagram. But to get this curve to come down, as in the data, you're probably going to have the inflation adjustment curve moving down, even though you're still at a situation where real GDP is greater than potential GDP. So symbolically, you can represent that or graphically represent that just by moving the aggregate demand curve back down as the Fed starts to raise interest rates. But in this case, your inflation comes down more quickly than in the model just used automatically. So it could be that people began to see the actions of the Fed and inflation started to fall. Or if you now realize that behind the scenes here, there were some other things going on. The movement of the aggregate demand curve to the right most likely was because the Fed held interest rates quite low and going into this, 2003, 4, and 5. That's when the GDP and the inflation rate began to rise. So that makes sense. And those low interest rates may have done some other things, though. They may have caused the housing boom, which occurred, may have caused investors to take on more risks, and then made the financial institutions less secure. In any case, what happened when the economy started to slow down is there was a huge shift in the aggregate demand curve. Investors began to lose confidence, so investment went down, consumers started to cut back. And so you see this shift way over to the left, which occurs in the data in that direction. Maybe even during the panic in 2008, it even goes further and at least temporarily drives inflation down. People are panicking in terms of prices. Firms are cutting prices to try to get back some of that demand. Fortunately, the panic period in 2008 doesn't last that long, so you shift back up. Curves will shift back up towards maybe in that region somewhere, and you're ending up at a point right there. Ending up, in a sense, that's where you are in 2013. Now, that's all plausible, but notice that you're below where you wanted to go. Somehow the economy looks like it's stuck. It's not coming back, at least not like we've seen in the past. And so what's the reason for that? What's the explanation? And to think about that, let's kind of just go through how this whole episode could be considered another boom-bust cycle, though on a much larger scale, and then see how the story needs to be adjusted. So first of all, there's evidence the Federal Reserve held interest rates, as they sometimes say, too low for too long in 2003, 2005, and that would have caused the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right and had inflation rise in the data, real GDP rising above potential. That rise in the inflation rate is what we saw in the data. But then there's a difference from the standard shifts of curves that the inflation rate shifts down even though there's a positive gap. And again, that could be occurring because of other measures of weakness in the economy, maybe relative to the housing market starting to collapse. In any case, real GDP then falls sharply. You saw that in the picture. It is a big recession, maybe due to the panic, maybe due to the housing collapse. Financial firms actually failing during this period. That's that sharp movement over to the left. But then you have this thing about you're being stuck. So why does the economy appear to be stuck? And there's basically, to put it simple terms, two big possible reasons, and economists are debating these. One is that the policies taken during this period may have had perverse negative effects themselves, or kind of holding the economy back. The other is that policy itself is running out of steam, and that could be because the mechanism of the policy rule, where the interest rates come down and up, is running into a bound, running into a barrier, running into a wall. And that is called the zero bound on the interest rate. It suggests that we may need some new actions. That's what's given rise to different actions the Fed has taken called quantitative easing, which we're going to see in future lessons. You can understand some of the rationale for that if you go back to the policy rule, and that's where we're going to end this. There's your monetary policy rule as we've drawn it several times before, the inflation rate on the horizontal axis, interest rate on the vertical axis. But in this case, we have to recognize that at some point the interest rate can go below zero. It's as far as it can go, and the Fed might try to lower it below zero, but it's not going to go below zero, so it's stuck. And that stuck is the second kind of major rationale for why the economy is stuck. The zero lower bound creates this if you like, rigidity. So there's two reasons, and what we want to do is, the best of our ability, is use this model, adjust it to try to determine which of these is the case. And that will be a subject for future discussions. Thank you very much.